I want to take some time to talk about astronomy, astrology, and myth in the ancient world. While much has been written on these subjects, no book has had a more profound impact on the topics than Hamlet's Mill. Through the research of Giorgio de Santillana of MIT and Heather von Deckend, University of Frankfurt, a new subscience called archaeoastronomy was born. The purpose of the book was to address the origins of human knowledge and its transmission through the language of myth. While doing their own independent work and research, both authors realized that what was once thought to be a jumbled mess of disconnected and incoherent fairy tales was in reality the ancient recordings of a long observed and highly sophisticated astronomy, along with the movements of the cosmos. These records have been transmitted through what the authors call the language of myth. For some reason, a civilization whose astronomical and mathematical achievement surpasses even our own felt it necessary to pass on their findings and set markers in place to assist us in tracking the motions of the planets, the moon, the solstices, and the equinoxes. A method of communication, which we have already identified, called myth, was used to transmit the past motions or the information of the past motions of the above. And monolithic stone structures were set in place to act as markers pointing to our current age. Both Santillana and Deckend assert that when it comes to anthropology and man's past, evolution has so polluted the ethos that archaeologists have willfully ignored the sophisticated astronomical knowledge that the ancients once possessed. These same archaeologists have attributed the above works to pagan rituals that just happen to coincidentally correspond with astronomical events. Both Santillana and Deckend assert that there is somewhat of a hostile relationship between archaeologists and astronomers. The one asserts that the ancients were too unsophisticated to accomplish any real astronomy, and the others simply say, look at the astronomy. Unfortunately, the archaeologists have had more influence on the matter, and as a result, even good Bible-believing Christians have been influenced. There are several accounts throughout the ancient world regarding this mythic astronomical knowledge. Josephus records accounts with Seth, Enoch, and the other descendants of Adam. He also records accounts with Abraham and Nimrod. Manetho, the historian, records ancient pre-flood, Egyptian pre-flood writings. And Ashurbanipal asserts that he was able to read the enigmatic writings of pre-flood Sumeria. What we would call, or what we know as astrology, has no bearing on what its original form was. Originally, it was an actual science. The problem is that we fail to apprehend the language of myth in its original intent. It is utter foolishness to think that those with the sophistication to construct with stone such megalithic and detailed astronomical markers somehow or another thought that there was a cause-effect relationship between the stars and the affairs of man. They did not think that there was fairies and unicorns running around up in the heavens. They did think that the cosmos had several purposes, one of which was to serve as markers for signs and seasons. See Genesis 1:14. Yes, it is true that corruptions found their way in and man began to worship the creation. Even today we see corruptions finding their way into virtually every form of science, as all disciplines are being forced to submit to an evolutionary worldview. Different types of structures were set in place to assist in keeping track as regarding the slow progression of the equinox as the cosmos and the equinoxes moved along the celestial plane. The stars were broke up into 12 groups according to the divinely appointed names, and mythological imagery was assigned to them. The Bible calls this the Mazareth. The most common image used is that of a dragon. The dragon is depicted in three forms along with the equatorial line, or along the equatorial line. The dragon is seen in the constellations of Hydra, Serpens, and Cetus. All have their head in the area of the waters above, also known as the dragon's head. All also have their tails in the area known as the waters below, also known as the dragon's tail. A fourth dragon is depicted in the constellation of Draco. It is in the extreme north and is positioned so as to appear to be pulling the solstices and equinoxes in the opposite direction of the Mazareth, that is the gospel and the stars. The intent of the cosmos has remained essentially intact even to this present age. It shows the struggle between our great Redeemer and his enemy, the dragon. When we look at the Akkadian and the Sumerian and the Babylonian creation epics, we can see how the enemy has co-opted the heavens for himself. Nonetheless, we will see how the Lord will use the enemy's own corruptions against him. Virtually all research tells us that the early Babylonian zodiac is the original zodiac. However, our biblical worldview tells us that the enemy imported a narrative into the zodiac and corrupted it for himself. This corruption is found in the Babylonian creation epic of 1900 BC. The following is a summary of the narrative. Many ages prior to the creation of anything, there were two beings that coexisted with each other. They were brought forth out of the chaos, both of them. One was male, masculine, and the other one was female, but transgender. Apsu was the name of the male, and Tiamat was the name of the female. Apsu was brought out of the fresh waters, Tiamat was brought out of the bitter waters, or the salt waters. At some point, they together created and brought forth what would later be called the Anukim. These Anukim were demigods. They were beings of divine nature and had certain qualities about them. One of them, by the name of Anu, grew mightier and more powerful than the rest. He brought forth a son in his own image and his own likeness and named him Marduk. At some point, a dispute occurred between Apsu and Tiamat. The issue was over the corruption of all that they had brought forth. Apsu wanted to destroy them all, but Tiamat opposed him. Tiamat organized a rebellion and won over all but a few of the Anakim to her side. Apsu conspired with others to kill the rebels. His conspiracy was discovered and Tiamat had him killed. Anu, his first begotten, called for any who could dispose of Tiamat. That is, Anu was the first begotten of Apsu, called for all who could depose or dispose of Tiamat. Some tried, but were terrified by her sight. Then Marduk came forth, the first begotten of Anu. He asked, that is, Marduk, asked if he should prevail, that all of the Anukim would be subject to him, and that he would receive all power and authority. Anu agreed, and fashioned the four winds, and gave Marduk power over them, so as to defeat Tiamat. As the battle began, Marduk threw a net at Tiamat. As she opened up her mouth to swallow the net, Marduk then took the four winds and threw them at her. And she tried to open her mouth and swallow the net. But Marduk took the four winds and threw them at her, and Tiamat could not close her mouth. Seizing the moment, he rushed into her. That is, Marduk rushed into Tiamat, rushed into her inner parts, and eviscerated her. Thus Marduk defeated Tiamat. Upon her defeat, Marduk killed 4 of the rebel Anukim. He then offered the rest to submit to him, and he would give them their own little fiefdoms of deity. The submission was based upon one condition. They had to behold his nakedness and take in his manliness. Even Anu, his father, submitted to this. Anu fashioned a Mashushu, a great red dragon, and deemed it the image by which Marduk would be known. From this point on, when Marduk spoke, his law could never be altered. Marduk then created the earth out of the remains of Tiamat, and man was brought forth of the earth. The Anukim were given dominion over men and oppressed them out of a recognition of Marduk's victory. All things made of Tiamat was to be considered evil and corrupt. Marduk then fashioned the moon and established the first 6 days of the lunar horns, or the crescent moon, or what we know as the new moon, as the horns of his power. He made crowns fashioned like the horns and placed them on the Anukim and gave them dominion. Marduk proclaimed himself Baal, Lord, and gave the title of Little Baal to all of the rulers of the Anukim. Marduk had more than 50 names by which he was known. These were character traits. The Baals would then be assigned the character traits and establish themselves as Baal hyphenated whatever character trait they were given. They were to spread themselves abroad. They were to establish themselves as Baals with that character trait name, and they were to construct shrines unto Baal wherever they went. Among his names were Asher-Luhi, the shining one, which also means to bow at the mention of his name. The land of Assyria is named after him with this name. Incidentally, on the Arabian Peninsula, Marduk was known as Mar-Ava. At some point, a council of the Anukim was convened, and they purposed that Marduk be given a place in the heavens and earth by which he could move about between the two. The place on earth would be called Babylon. It would be a place wherein all the vices of corruption of men would be freely made available, by which they can remain in corruption and enslaved. Prostitution, homosexuality, feminism, transgenderism, carousing, parties, and any other vice which would impede man in his masculinity was offered and disseminated from Babylon. Thus, he is to be reminded of his transgender origins by these vices. A temple to Baal and his dragon was to be Marduk's seat on earth in Babylon. Marduk himself decreed his place in the heavens. He spoke a constellation, according to him, into existence. This constellation accordingly was Draco. He established himself in the crossings, or the Nibiru. Okay? In the Chaldean, that's what it's called. He established himself in the crossings of both the equatorial and the ecliptic plane. It would be in the place of the plane, it would be the place of his dragon and the appointed star by which the crossings would be known. None would be allowed to pass without permission of Marduk and his dragon. These crossings are the ecliptic lines and the equatorial lines by which the sun and the moon pass over, through which there are also the equinoxes and eclipses. This appears to be the origin of the concept of a dragon dwelling both in the equatorial and ecliptic nodes, where the equinoxes and eclipses, both solar and lunar, take place. The language of the dragon and the nodes is still with us today. An eclipse is not the dragon. An eclipse reveals the dragon, as the dragon comes out to swallow up the sun or the moon. Since the ascending and the descending nodes are always present, so too is the dragon. This is an example of the language of mythological imagery. Everyone knew what this meant. We see this in Jeremiah 51:34, where it talks about being swallowed up like a dragon. The Babylonian creation account is obviously a corruption of the biblical record. Nonetheless, it represents the worldview of the post-flood age and how they viewed the Anakim and those related to them. The way the world thought back then is so much more different than the way that we think now. It seems unimaginable to us. Before we conclude, I want to take a moment to address the person of Nimrod and the institution of emperor worship. Nimrod is briefly mentioned in the book of Genesis, and not much is said about him. However, there are Assyrian records and the records of Josephus that tell us he was a contemporary of Abraham. According to extra-biblical records, Nimrod established the concept of emperor worship. In other words, the emperor being the incarnation of Marduk. As such, he made depictions of himself defeating Tiamat and assumed Marduk's dragon for himself. Like Marduk, when Nimrod spoke, his law could never be changed. This practice carried on all the way through the Persian era. The apocryphal book, Baal and the Dragon, goes to illustrate how much Baal, Marduk, and his dragon were revered by Cyrus during Daniel's day. The dragon is mentioned in other places in the Old Testament, but it is not until Revelation 12 that he is clearly identified as Satan. Prior to and during this video, I hope you have picked up on certain themes. The four corners, the four winds, lunar horns, the name we bow down to at, the begotten Son, the whore of Babylon, the shining one, the law that cannot be changed, and later on, the new heavens and the new earth, among many others. Later on, we will address the concept of the new heavens and the new earth. The reality is that unless we transport ourselves back in time to the world the Bible was written in, we can end up looking for the wrong things in the wrong places at the wrong time. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video, and I pray and I hope and pray that it is very helpful. We'll be doing a few more in the next coming days, so please be patient with us as we work through this. Thank you.